Hey guys, tonight we open the doors of Whitehall and step directly into the final hours of Henry VIII, where the stench of infected ulcers mixes with thick incense smoke. Freshly removed bandages are still sodden with fluid, and physicians are making incisions for drainage, rinsing clean, packing in remedies, and binding the wounds right there at the bedside. You will see swelling, patches of bruised skin, foul breath, and the brutal treatments of the time, heating irons, burning fragrant resins to mask the odor, changing the dressings multiple times a day, all of it both horrifying and desperate. I am certain you would not survive it if you were standing there, because the raw truth of disease, the level of revulsion, and the procedures of that era are anything but gentle, contrary to what books often gloss over. So, before you settle in, take 1 second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In January of 1547 at Whitehall, each time the door to the chamber eased open, a heavy layer of air seemed to pour out. Seasoned servants still raised a hand to cover their mouths. Even polished envoys felt their eyes sting. Henry VIII was no longer the vigorous king of his radiant years. His body was failing. The public outside heard soothing phrases that the king was unwell because of old age. That fatigue was only natural. But inside the palace, everyone sensed an uncanny, unsettling odor, and disagreeable rumors coiled about even before anyone dared speak of a funeral. Every whisper returned to a single cause, recalled again and again. A fall on the tilt yard one winter many years before. The wound on his leg had seemed small then, like a scratch that would close after a few days. Yet it did not heal. On the contrary, it swelled, burrowed deeper, and oozed. Ceremonies in the courtyard still rang with hoofbeats, brass, and the rasp of armor. But behind the curtains, the aching leg burned like a furnace that would not be quenched. Each morning, when the bandages were removed, a sharp sour smell rushed up, darkening the faces of those standing near. From a dazzling young king who loved hunting, singing, and society, Henry VIII was betrayed by his own body. Familiar pleasures were set aside one by one, giving way to a life measured by bouts of pain. The royal physicians trusted the knife and their remedies. They incised, they pressed, they packed odor-masking substances into the lesion. At times the fever dropped for a few days, and the household exhaled in relief, only for the illness to return like an undertow. The wound was like a pit, swallowing medicines and patients alike, yielding nothing but exhaustion. Skillful hands, fresh silk bandages, old-style antiseptics, all seemed to vanish into that pit to no effect. In the corridors, people spoke in circles. No one dared voice the fearful thing, so they chose gentle phrases. The king is at rest. The king is sensitive to the weather. The king requires quiet. In reality, there were long sleepless nights, steps that grew laborious, and an unnatural odour trailing the throne. Servants learned to open doors very softly, to tread lightly, to speak in low tones, as if sound itself could startle the wound. Audiences shortened. Diversions were postponed, and the atmosphere of the palace slowly changed its hue. That prolonged pain not only pinned the king to an upstairs room, it seeped into his temper. Where pain lingers, patience wears thin. Where odours stagnate, reason sours. Henry VIII, once generous, fond of display, eager for bustle, now collided with a steady, smouldering irritability. Each decision bore the imprint of fatigue, suspicion, at times, a sudden heat. Those around him understood there was a fine line between a relatively steady day and a day when grey clouds settled over court. a line that hinged on a sore place in his leg. Outside, music still sounded on occasions when the dignity of the realm had to be kept. But behind the curtains, everything turned around the footstool. The rolls of bandage, the bottles of medicine, heavy drapes blocked the wind as well as prying eyes. Even so, the sour smell threaded through. Sometimes, before dawn broke, servants went back and forth to change the dressings. They grew so used to the rhythm that they measured time by those changes, by how strong the smell was after each night. Each time the bandage was opened, the whole room seemed to shrink. Even the polite inquiries changed their tone. "How is the king's health today?" became a ritual, a question whose vague answer was already known. Courtiers pressed their lips together under envoys' searching looks. Anyone who had stood close to the throne knew there was a secret that needed no words. The odour and the pain were two silent witnesses to a dark moment drawing near. The whole court learned to adapt to the cycle, hope for a few days of lowered fever, then brace for the next relapse. From this point, shifts in the king's temper became the backdrop to every event. A dusky wash laid over the political picture. The story, therefore, is not merely that of a wound. It is a story of how the body can govern the mind, how a smell can drive others away, how a pain can bend the schedule of an entire reign. Henry VIII was still the king, still crowned, still receiving petitions. But beneath the rites lay a body in decay, a wound that refused to close, a source of pain that gave no hint of ceasing. And from that seemingly small starting point, a chain of dark changes unspooled, pulling along decisions that would leave lasting marks, beginning with a winter on the tilt yard, pausing at Whitehall in the cold first month, and reflecting into all that followed. There, among the floor's bricks and the heavy curtains, history's mute reply began to sound. A body can betray a dynasty, and a dynasty can fade in colour because of a wound that will not heal. As Henry VIII's ability to walk diminished, his meals grew heavier, the platters more laden, while the geography of his days narrowed to chair, bed, pillows, and a handful of fixed rooms. He had a lifting chair constructed and taught his servants to read the lines of his face, to understand when pain seized him, and to help before he spoke. The wound was no longer a speck upon the skin. It spread its influence across every habit of his daily life. It stole his sleep, sharpened his irritability, and forced him to lean upon others for each small movement. The air in his chamber felt dense, and the candles wavered and guttered, as if the room itself were short of breath. Aromatics amber, leona, frankincense could mask the odour only for a fleeting interval. The entire court learned a new etiquette. They bowed while holding their breath, smiled with lips closed, and withdrew swiftly, yet with decorum intact. Courtiers practiced the art of presence without nearness, of respect without proximity, of conversation reduced to what could be spoken in a single calm exhalation. Pages learned to glide rather than step, ushers to open doors on the quietest hinge, attendants to anticipate a gesture before it hardened into command. But in truth, the chamber dictated the choreography. Enter. Incline. Murmur. Retreat, all before the sour air pressed against the lungs. Night was the worst. The pain roughed his gaze, made his judgment sterner, and trimmed the allowance he had once given to human frailty. Forgiveness thinned in the darkness. Toward first light, when the ache was at its most insistent and sleep had failed him yet again, he issued decisions with a heat that dawn could not cool. Those early rulings carried the imprint of a body kept awake, and a mind forced to think in the narrow margins between pulses of pain. At times, he opened the bandages himself to look, as if the body might yield an answer the physicians could not supply. What he saw was not merely injured flesh, but a signpost pointing toward the end of a life. The wound's borders told a story his counsel dared not read aloud. A reign circumscribed by a lesion, a future abridged by a single failing limb. Each inspection was a quiet inquest, He studied colour, moisture, the stubbornness of the weeping edges, and in them recognized a truth that no envoy, no herald, no proclamation could soften. From that point, smell and pain were no longer medical conditions. They became the weather of politics. They shaped how courtiers behaved and how the king decided. Advisers weighed not only the merits of petitions but the hour of the approach. The thickness of the air, the rhythm of the candles, the tilt of the king's jaw. A favourable audience demanded more than argument. It required timing the request to a trough in the pain, to the moment when the aromatics had not yet spent themselves, when his breathing was slower, his eyes less flinted. The palace itself began to fill with fragrance in an effort to conceal what could not be cleansed. Bowls of resin stood in niches. Sachets were hidden behind arras and under cushions. Reed diffusers were tucked near vents and door frames, yet the effect was brief and incomplete. A veil that fluttered rather than covered. Amber, leuna, and frankincense mingled with the sourness until the scent became a palimpsest sweetness written over rot, and rot showing through. It was the olfactory emblem of a court that strained to preserve its dignity while acknowledging a truth it could not dismiss. Within this perfumed struggle, the king's routines hardened. Meals arrived on a schedule dictated less by appetite than by the need to brace him for medicine, for dressings, for the effort of standing or shifting in the chair. Servants learned to measure success by the absence of a wince, to value a quiet hour more than a lavish feast. Conversation shortened. Audiences became a matter of careful syllables, of putting the essential first, because the body allowed only so much speech before the face tightened and the hand rose, not in anger, but in surrender to the stab within. The bed, the chair, the footstool, the pillows. These became the compass points of a narrowed realm. Between them stretched corridors of protocol and pain. The king's reach remained vast in law and title, but his physical sovereignty shrank to spans of floor pace slowly, and to the angle at which a leg could be supported without igniting that inner fire. Even triumphs were tempered by logistics. Where to sit, how long to stand, how to mask the smell for the length of a ceremony, how to time a signature to the minute when the throbbing eased. And so the court perfected its new etiquette, to bow and not breathe, to smile and keep the lips sealed, to leave swiftly and still maintain face. It was a language of restraint, a choreography of care that signaled loyalty while acknowledging the tyranny of pain. Behind it lay a collective understanding that the sovereign's body was now the hidden counselor in every matter, that policies and pardons, favours and refusals, might hinge on whether the bandage was fresh or failing, whether the aromatics still held or had already given way. The palace's growing tide of scent, a saturation of resins, oils, and herbs announced the next chapter before it was named, a desperate attempt to drown a smell that would not be drowned. It was gallant and futile at once, a floral armour against a foe that lived beneath the skin, and within that mingled air, Henry VIII met each dawn. A king, measuring out rulings between pulses of hurt, a court holding its breath as the candles trembled, and a realm learning that sometimes the fate of many can be bent by the wound of one. The court stokes the fires higher, burns resins thicker, and hands out pomanders like small shields. Whitehall turns into a perfumer's workshop, orange peel scraped into curls, clove crushed beneath pestles, rosemary bruised between palms, musk uncorked, ambergris melted and stirred into warm wine. Yet the odour from the wound slips past every brocade layer and every lined curtain, threads the seams, and goes straight to the back of the throat. Winter has pinned the windows shut. The rushes underfoot are damp and stale. Candlelight works harder and still looks tired inside the incense haze. A new routine takes hold. Ambassadors tuck lavender sprigs into their sleeves and chew fennel seeds to steady their faces. Pages practice the timing of a bow so it happens on an empty lung. The body already exhaled. The groom of the stool marshals a quiet team. Linens boiled in vinegar, mattresses aired and turned, bowls of herbs refreshed before the leaves can brown. Each dressing change becomes a fixed procedure wash. Pack. Bind performed with the gravity of a ritual. Hope flares for a breath or two. Then gutters when the heat in the leg rises again. Speech itself changes shape. Phrases grow shorter. Laughter thins. People avoid words that demand too much air. Rumour, which needs little breath, fills the space left behind. They say the carpets are being replaced because the old ones have learned the scent too well. They say screens have been set up to divert drafts, to keep the smell from wandering toward the chapel. They say notes are passed hand to hand, discreet and folded tight, mapping which corridors to avoid, at which hours. Those who once knew Henry in his youth, the tang of horse and clean leather, the easy strength feel, a private betrayal, as the heir now announces him before any herald can. Fear of his temper shifts into fear of the atmosphere that walks ahead of him like an invisible entourage. Inside this fog of perfume and necessity, instinctive acts of self-preservation, misfire, a quick turn of the head, a held breath, a step back toward a window. Gestures meant for survival are read as alignment, disapproval, or whispering loyalty to one side or another. The king's chamber hardens into a theatre of courtesy. Everyone practices a composed face and careful posture, smooth motions and measured replies. They pretend calm while silently counting the steps to the nearest door. Measuring distance, the way others might measure risk. Bow. Answer. Retreat. Bow. Answer. Retreat. The choreography repeats beneath the humming veil of scent. Fires are fed again. Resin oozes and smokes. Bowls of spiced wine steam gently and release their sweetness into the room. But the others smell earthy, insistent. Intimate threads the sweetness and finds the human inside it. No fabric stops it for long. No braid of lavender and rosemary can push it back more than a few heartbeats. The winter cold helps nothing. The air recycles the same breath over and over. And the tapestries keep secrets they never asked to hold. When the door opens, something invisible moves first, and the body follows behind. The routine grows precise. Vinegar carries a sharpness through the corridors. Water warms in pans. Folded cloth sits stacked like pages waiting for an editor. Wash. Pack. Bind. Wash. Pack. Bind. The order never varies. And still the outcome refuses to change. Hope is a candle set too near a draught. It flares. It leans. It goes out. Afterward the voices are quieter. The answers shorter. Even yolks, when they appear, arrive, trimmed close to the bone, and end before a second breath can be taken. Outside the chamber, rumour breeds logistics. Replace the carpets. Move the screens. Close this passage at that hour. The notes travel with the discretion of people who understand that smell is a kind of news in this version of court life. A map is made not of power, but of air currents. Which staircase carries less? Which landing keeps it longer? Which chapel door must be opened only after candles are already burning? No one says conspiracy. But everyone behaves as if the wrong inhale could be a declaration. Those who remember Henry in the saddle feel the distance between then and now most keenly. Leather polished by use. The energy of a hunt. The sweat of a day outdoors. These memories collide with the present haze. Nostalgia curdles into caution. The fear that once attached to a flash of royal anger attaches now to the invisible layer that precedes him down a corridor. It teaches a different etiquette. Not how to speak, but how not to breathe. Under the fragrant smoke, the chamber arranges itself into civility. Chairs are set at exact angles. Cushions straightened. Curtains drawn to the same length. Courtesy fills the space, the way incense fills the rafters. The performance is faultless. Hands steady. Voice even. Bows neither too deep nor too shallow. Yet within the neatness a calculation continues. As steady as the ticking of a clock. How many steps to the door? How many heartbeats to the stair? How many words before the breath runs out? People do not answer these aloud. They hold the numbers in their chests and ration their sentences accordingly. The perfumes do their best work, and then withdraw, defeated for the moment. The wound's scent returns as if it had only stepped into the corridor and come back in by another door. The winter does not forgive. Drafts shift slowly. Candles, tunnel, and smoke. The rushes underfoot whisper their damp complaints, and still the schedule carries on. The ambassadors with their lavender, the pages with their practiced bows, the groom of the stool with his vinegar-boiled linens, and his quiet army ready to change the bed before the heat can sink in too deep. Wash, pack, bind. The refrain continues. Hope, flare, fade. The counter-melody answers. In between, conversation shortens to what can be said in one breath. Laughter is rare because laughter is expensive. The room learns to live within the limits set by air and odor. And everywhere, in every adjustment and every rumor, the same understanding spreads. Ceremony can decorate the moment, but it cannot seal it. The smell moves through cloth and courtesy alike, and the court moves with it. Careful, polite, and always a little closer to the door. Incense smoke blurs the edges of the room. The long ache blurs the edges of judgment. Night after night, Henry VIII lies awake. And the sleeplessness breeds suspicion. What was once a pause for consideration becomes a pause for doubt. The air is thick. The curtains hold the scent. And under that cover his thoughts circle narrow tracks. Pain keeps time the way a drum does. A dull throb. A quickened pulse. A flash of temper. The longer the body nags, the closer the mind leans toward shadows. He used to be decisive. Now he becomes certain too quickly. A look becomes a verdict. A hesitation turns into guilt. A whispered aside hardens into proof. The flare of anger comes sooner, as if each order must be lit with the same spark that keeps the brazier burning. Courtiers feel the change in the cadence of the day. Questions are shorter, answers must be immediate, and the wrong word spoken on the wrong breath can tilt an hour into ruin. Around him the council moves like chess pieces on a board that will not stay still. Reformers hold their places. Traditionalists hold theirs. And each camp waits for the king to tilt toward it. Even half a degree. Chair scrape. Papers shift. And the smallest nod is read as a move. A raised eyebrow is a knight. A cleared throat is a bishop. A silence can feel like check. Every man counts not only votes but minutes. How long since the last spasm of pain? How near the next wave of temper? And adjusts his stance accordingly. Servants pass the word from mouth to mouth that in the dark hours he calls names. A former wife. A favourite. The dead, who can answer nothing. The chamber hears the list. And by morning the room feels hotter. Then comes a string of sharp decisions, mercy trimmed thin. What is refused at midnight will not be granted at noon. What is granted at dawn may be revoked before the candles are snuffed. The rhythm is familiar now. A restless night. An impatient morning. An afternoon of careful faces. Access becomes the master key. Those who can stand the air the longest. Those who do not flinch at the odour. Those who can keep their voices level while the breath runs short. These are the ones who get a word into the royal ear. Distance means silence. Nearness means influence. A man's stomach becomes part of his politics. If he can keep it steady, he can speak. If not, he waits outside the door with the others who will be too late. At this moment, the dry stamp, the device that applies the royal signature without the royal hand, is used again and again. Paper carries a name, even when the body is absent or too tired to hold a pen. Orders can move while the man who owns them lies with his eyes closed. Seals harden on wax moons. A sheet leaves the chamber bearing what looks like consent. The line between voice and mechanism thins, and with it the line between request and command. Secret notes appear. Folded and warm from a pocket, accusations arrive. Written fast in midnight ink. Proof is assembled out of what can be found before dawn. A phrase overheard. A gesture remembered. A letter copied by a hand that refused sleep. The hallway learns to carry messages the way it once carried music. Doors open a little and shut again. Eyes meet and fall away. The business of the realm begins to sound like whispering. The Howard name draws the light and cannot shrug it off. Thomas Howard, the young and proud Earl of Surrey, is looked at as if pride itself were a plan. Ambition is assumed where confidence once stood. Heraldry is read like a confession. Colours and quarterings treated as paragraphs in a case. A flourish becomes a claim becomes a threat. One boast is trap enough. A man can walk down a staircase and find that it ends at a locked door, and the air on the other side is colder. Priests come and go with faces composed against both smell and danger. They bring prayer. But theology now works like a test. The words are weighed for alignment as much as for comfort. A creed can be a cord. A blessing can be a blade. They keep their voices even and their hands steady. But they know that doctrine is being used to measure loyalty as neatly as any yard of cloth. Pain sets the backbeat. Ache. Pulse. Anger. It is the measure by which the day is cut. Under that beat, the line between illness and policy fades. A choice about a man feels like a choice about a symptom. A ruling sounds like a response to a twinge. Sentences arrive softly, without trumpet or drum. A nod replaces a declaration. A pointed finger does the work of a paragraph. A door failing to open serves as well as a shouted command. No one is sure anymore why a punishment lands where it does. Was it a true offence? Was it a wince at the wrong time that looked like disrespect? Was it the king's irritation at the air itself? Or is something else at work, the ache for a golden past that will not return? The bitterness that comes when the mirror offers a different man than the one memory prefers. In that uncertainty, the court learns a new caution. Men rehearse neutral faces as carefully as they once rehearsed arguments. They ration words, the way a traveller rations water. Incense still burns. The haze still lies low along the floor. Sleep still comes in pieces, and suspicion fills the gaps between those pieces. The council continues to glide and settle, and rise and glide again. The servants continue to pass their quiet reports. The device continues to press its power into wax. The name continues to travel faster than the man whose name it is. In this atmosphere, cause and effect go soft at the edges. The smell is one thing, the temper another, the policy a third, yet all three walk in step down the same corridor. So the chamber keeps its performance of calm. The bows arrive on time. The phrases are correct. The curtains hang in perfect lines. But the true measure is invisible. How near a body can stand to the bed. How long a voice can stay, even in stale air. How quickly a certainty can be formed and set to paper, under the smoke and over the ache. This is how days turn now by access, by device, by rumour, by emblem, and how nights echo them, name by name, breath by breath, until morning demands decisions again. By this point, the illness is no longer confined to the leg. It touches the whole body. Heat rolls off him even when the hearth sits cold. The pulse hammers hard at the temple and thins at the wrist. Sleep comes in little scraps and drifts away again. Shallow and broken, bandages must be changed 2 or 3 times each day. The smell does not merely go ahead of the king anymore. It seems to rise from under the skin itself, as if the flesh has begun to speak in its own language. He eats a great deal meat in heavy portions. Sauce is thick enough to cling to the spoon. Wine poured and repoured, as if food could smother pain by sheer volume. The belly swells. Shoes must be widened. Rings are eased off with oil. Chairs are reinforced with steel, so they will hold without complaint. The less he moves, the more the body resents being used like a throne. Discomfort breeds in stillness, and every hour spent sitting adds to the tally that the body will demand later. There are days that seem better. The skin looks calmer. The heat lowers. I hope breathes for a moment. Then the fever returns like a tide that never promised to stay out. Physicians wash. They press. They pack. They use animal fat and aromatic herbs, believing in what hands can do and what mixtures might draw out what does not belong. The room takes on that difficult blend. A sweetness laced with iron. A smell that turns the stomach, even as it claims to heal. The king's breath changes. It carries a strange hint of sweetness, a sign that infection has widened its borders. Skin mottles in uneven patches, ankles puff and hold water, and more cushions are slid beneath the calves to coax the swelling away. Stairs, once no more than a stage for a stride, become enemies to be avoided. He travels by chair, on the strength of other men, moved carefully by those who know how heavy silence can be when four shoulders must bear it. People argue over causes. Some say the weight, the blood sugar, the circulation that fails to keep pace. Some say the long war with infection has simply outlasted the skill of the healers. Others whisper other diagnoses. The most likely truth is simpler and more ruthless, a coalition of weight, the old wound, and time itself, each adding its share until the sum is too large to pay. Whatever the labels, the pattern is the same. The body's corners are starved of ease, and toll is taken for every heartbeat. At night he sends for a cleric, dictates revisions to a will, then in the morning discards them, as if darkness had only been a rehearsal. The device that applies the royal signature without the royal hand stays close to the bed, ready for use. He asks most often for four things: water, prayer, the surgeon, and quiet. Each request arrives with urgency, and each provides only a few minutes of peace before the cycle begins again. Nothing lasts long now. Not comfort, not anger, not resolve. The body weakens part by part. The legs go first. The lungs follow. The heart tries to carry the rest, insisting on its duty, even as the vote is lost. Servants learn the mathematics of crisis, how to move quickly without seeming to rush, how to trade places without clatter, how to set a basin down so softly it does not sound like fear. They practice calm the way soldiers practice drill, because panic wastes breath, and breath has become a precious coin. There are moments when he softens. He looks at the thick carapace of bandages that has become a second skin, and something like weariness passes across his face. A recognition that the wrappings are both shield and surrender. Then the softening ends. Irritation returns. And with it, the reach for the only weapon that still obeys authority. He uses what power remains to punish, to cut short a career with a gesture, to mark a name for loss. This too is part of the pattern, a swing from quiet to command, from patience to reprisal. Beneath all of it, the smell persists. It rises when voices fall. It threads conversations and shortens vows. It sits in the grain of wood and the weave of linen. It hovers at ankle height and climbs to the pillows. People begin to grow used to it. And that is its own danger. What should never be normal starts to feel like weather, something to be endured rather than named. The court adjusts its breathing. Tea pass? It sentences, until habit looks like acceptance. So the days pass in this measured way. Heat when there should be none. A hard beat at the temple, and a weak one at the wrist. Sleep in fragments. Bandages stripped and replaced 2 or 3 times before night. Food offered as if it could bargain with pain. Wine poured as if comfort could be drunk. Shoes widened. Rings oiled. Chairs strengthened with steel. Some relief. Then the tides return, washing, pressing, packing with animal fat and herbs, whose fragrance cannot defeat the iron note, breath that tastes wrong, skin that bruises, without remembering a blow. Ankle lifted, stairs avoided, chair and bearers, instead of stride and stare. Explanation differ weight. Sugar, blood, infection, rumour, but the effect does not. Night summons cleric and pen. Morning wipes the slate clean. The device for a signature without a hand lies within reach. Water, prayer, surgeon, quiet. The 4-beat refrain that buys a few minutes at a time. The body declines by sections. The household moves fast without noise. Sometimes he is gentle. Often he is not. And always. Under the order and the ritual. The smell remains. Teaching everyone, step by step, to live with what no one should ever learn to accept. In the final nights, the servants lay a cloth and absorbent pads beneath the back and legs of Henry VIII. Yet the fluid from the wound continues to seep at a steady pace. They slide fresh linens under him with practiced hands. But each attempt to stay ahead of the leakage only buys a little time. The bed learns the sound of damp fabric being lifted away and replaced. The floor learns the path of careful feet that have done this many times before. Even in the hush of the room, the labour is audible, a rustle, a lift, a muted fold, a new sheet drawn tight. No matter how many layers are arranged, the seepage finds them, marks them, and asks for more. Each time the bandages are removed, the room changes, smell as clearly as a door opening. It turns harsh, then cloying, then simply wrong. The physicians follow the familiar procedure without hurry and without pause. Wash what can be washed. Pack what must be packed. Bind what needs binding. Basins are changed, towels are changed, and fresh ones appear as if from nowhere. Vinegar is added. Rose water is added. The air briefly stings, then softens, then settles into a discomfort that refuses to leave. The king slips between clarity and confusion. He gives an order, then withdraws it within the same hour. A name is called to the bedside, then the same name is struck a moment later. Lists shorten and lengthen under the same breath. The device that applies the royal signature without the royal hand waits on a nearby table, near enough to touch without rising. It exists to turn decisions into documents the instant they are spoken. It makes it possible for orders to be recognized even when the body that owns them is too weary to lift a pen. When the archbishop is invited in, voices drop of their own accord. There is the rhythm of prayer, low and steady, and the rustle of sleeves as men lean closer in respect. Those present say that when counsel is offered to trust in grace, the king cannot form words, but his fingers close with the smallest pressure, a touch so slight it could be reflex, yet enough for witnesses to count it as a sign. Beyond the bedchamber, the palace prepares for what everyone knows must follow. The carpenters measure without speaking, marking length and width with quiet taps. The tailors thread needles and draw seams, the fabric dark and formal beneath their hands. The clerks copy out lists, then copy them again, careful with names and ranks, careful with the items that will be given and the titles that will be borne. Inside the room, a bucket rests beneath the edge of the bed, catching what the bandages cannot hold. It is an hourglass made of sound. Drop, then drop, then drop. A small counting that cannot be ignored. The servants move around it as if around a clock. At last, the breathing shortens. The space between inhalations stretches until it feels like a distance that cannot be crossed. There is no shout and no omen. Death arrives quietly, ordinary in its finality, and the body stops its work. The hands that have tightened and loosened now lie still. The features do not announce anything new. The absence announces itself. Those who stand nearby know it before anyone speaks. The candles burn on, indifferent to endings. After the last breath, the air does not clear. It thickens, as if the room has decided to keep a trace of the man who lay there. The weight of that choice is felt in the chests of those who remain. This scene closes a long season of sickness and opens onto the matter of what must be done next. A coffin must be made. The body must be prepared. The process is undertaken with care and with speed. Not rushed, not slow, but steady in the way of practice tasks. The plan is to move him in the dark hours, when fewer eyes are open, so that the passage will draw less attention. The hope is simple and firm, that a shell of lead, sealed as tightly as skilled hands can manage, will hold in what must be held in, and that the dignity of a king can be kept whole before the public gaze. The palace continues its work with that hope in mind, each step taken as if it might be the one that secures the rest. Within the chamber, the traces remain for a while. The vinegar, the rosewater, the folded cloth still warm from hands, the bucket half full, the bed that knows too much. Beyond the chamber, the news moves the way news always moves in such places, carried by people who do not need to raise their voices to be heard. The line between the private moment and the public ritual begins to form. One belongs to the room and the few who stood in it. The other belongs to corridors and courtyards and the pressed silence of crowds. Between them stands the coffin that must be made and the ceiling that must succeed. So the servants finish what can be finished. The physicians put their tools away. The clerics close their books. The cloth is smoothed once more. The door opens and closes one last time for the dead man. The palace turns toward the next task. And then the next. There will be a procession. But not yet. There will be words spoken in halls. But not yet. For now there is night work. And the careful promise that lead and craft can preserve a face of honour. It is a promise everyone wants to believe. It is a promise that will travel with the coffin into the dark. After the laying out, the body of Henry VIII was placed in a coffin sheathed in lead and sealed tight to stop both odour and rumour. At first, everything seemed in order. The chamber felt as if it could breathe again. The air lightened. The attendants stood straighter, and for a few guarded minutes it appeared that metal and ceremony had mastered what cloth and medicine could not. It did not last. Before long, the seams of solder showed a glistening damp, and the skin of the lead looked as if it were sweating. A sheen gathered along the joins, beading, threatening to gather into something more. Eyes that had learned to read bandages now learned to read metal. And the same dread returned in a new form. The body, though hidden, still spoke. When the coffin was moved by night to Sion Abbey at that stillest hour when halls go hollow and even whispers seem loud, a dark stain appeared beneath the bier. It spread slowly and evenly. A patient blot that ignored rank and ritual, servants sprang forward with additional cloths, laying them down in quick layers. But the stain crept onward, as if indifferent to their haste. The linen darkened, and the men, already bent from the lift, bent their heads further in hope and embarrassment. A plumber was called. He examined the seams with a craftsman's dread, hands hovering first, then touching, then tapping, listening for a telltale change in the metal's note. He reheated the joints and fed fresh solder into the silvered lines, reinforcing what had failed. Others brought lamps closer, their faces worried by the double risk. If they succeeded, there would be only a quiet relief. If they failed, there would be a grave incident in a sacred place. While the irons hissed and the solder ran, the air altered again. A sweetness in the wrong place leaked into the chapel precincts, not the resinous sweetness of incense, but a cloying, misplaced note that made the faithful tighten their throats. From that moment grew the legend of the dog. Some said a stray crept near and licked at the place where the fluid had found the flagstones. Some said a servant drove the animal off at once. Others denied that any creature came close. Historians have argued the dog for generations, tracing and retracing who reported what to whom and when. Yet the core truth has never changed. The coffin leaked. The attempt at control after death had encountered a flaw, and the flaw was visible. The plumber worked on, and at length the damp was checked. Cloths were changed again. The place was wiped and wiped. But even as the sheen dried and the stains ceased to spread, the story gathered pace. Rumour, which needs neither seal nor escort, moved faster than the funeral train. By morning, the tale was a faint smudge passed between low voices. By noon, it was a large rumour running along corridors, filling alcoves, entering rooms before doors fully opened. Each teller added a fragment, and the fragments became adornments. One said the lead had cracked, another swore it had squealed, a third insisted it had popped. Words for small failures in metal became metaphors. For a larger failure, none dared name aloud. The details varied, but every version curved back to a single idea. Nothing can be concealed perfectly. Lead is not eternity. Seams are not silence. For a monarchy that had wrapped itself in pageant and proclamation, the implication cut deep. The leak was not only a flaw in solder, it was a blow to royal dignity. A reminder that even a king's body must submit to decay. The lead that was meant to guard the sovereign from the gaze of common noses and common talk had turned into a surface that testified against secrecy. The court felt the sting, and with it a chill, as if the laws of nature had stepped into the procession and taken a place among the mourners. The procession continued, because such things must. The bearers steadied their pace. The torches kept their measured sway. The prayers were said with voices tuned to solemnity. Yet the fear of an ill omen walked ahead of the coffin. It reached doorways before the pall did, and it sat on the lips of those who stood aside to let the company pass. Even the careful strengthening of the seams could not undo what had been seen, nor the extra cloths unring the hour when cloths had proved too few. Within Sion's walls, the repair held. The plumber wiped his tools. The servants folded the soiled linens away. The men with lamps returned the flames to their proper distance. The chapel's scent was coaxed back toward frankincense and calm, but the memory of the wrong sweetness endured, and the understanding it carried could not be blunted. Control had slipped, briefly yet undeniably, and that slip had told a truth that ceremony exists to veil. By afternoon, in the palace that had sent its sovereign into the night, the rumour wore its noon-shaped boulder, more embroidered, given weight by repetition. In antechambers and along galleries, people spoke of lead and of sound, of seams and of signs. No one needed to say the word omen aloud. It was present in every lifted eyebrow, every carefully neutral phrase. If there is a law of funerals, it is this: dignity is the goal, but contingency is the companion. Here, both walked side by side. Thus the cortege moved on, outwardly composed, inwardly pricked by unease. The lead-lined coffin, once a promise of containment, had become a reminder of limits. And above the slow march and the set faces hovered the lesson that no art, not balm, not cloth, not metal can wholly still the work of time. The ill-omened thought travelled in front, invisible yet felt, a step ahead of the pall, a breath ahead of the prayers. They hoped that St. George's Chapel at Windsor, with its thick stones and solemn rites, would keep everything contained. The cortege moved slowly beneath black drapery. Soldiers, clergy, and officers of state keeping grave faces, as if their expressions might help hold the ceremony together. Along the road, at the churches where the party halted, bowls of herbs were changed again and again, and fresh resins were set alight to smother any remnant odour that might rise. Even those who had known battlefields found themselves unsettled when the church doors closed, and the mingled scents, pious smoke and something not at all pious seemed to soak into the timbers. Curiosity and rumour walked ahead of the procession like eager pages. Someone waited for thunder, as if the heavens would pronounce upon the journey. Someone else waited for perfect silence, as if nature might show a sign by withholding every sound. Neither came. What came? To those who stood very still and breathed very little, was only a very light sweetness out of place, enough to run a shiver along the skin. It did not shout. It insinuated. It suggested that stone and incense might help, yet could not command. At St. George's, the chains took the weight, and the pulleys spoke in their steady, even voice. The sound carried clearly through the stony air, a measured clatter set within a vault that returned every note. Down went the coffin into the darkness, prepared for it, and no one said the overt word for omen. They spoke instead of being careful, of doing all with reverence, words that allowed the moment to be named without naming it. Heads bowed, hands folded, feet placed precisely. The discipline of ritual stood between the living and the thought they did not wish to think. Once the coffin had been set upon its place, talk circulated among those charged with watching. One caretaker told, in a cautionary whisper, that even after a few days, a faint sweet scent could be sensed at ankle height, as if something breathed up from the stone at night. Another insisted there was nothing of the kind, that such stories were imagination in a space made for echoes. The contradiction went on quietly, as contradictions do in sacred buildings, one voice cancelling another, without quite erasing it, however the air may have been. One fact required no debate. Henry VIII was laid near Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him the heir. He long sought a detail so sharp with irony that no commentator needed to embroider it. The closeness did its own speaking. Proximity stood in for epigram. Where the body lay said what paragraphs could not. Outside, the rites drew to their measured end. Processional patterns unravelled back into ordinary paths. Those who had marched returned to their appointed rooms. The city resumed its commerce with a gradual rise of sound like a tide. Inside, the chapel turned to tasks that attend any great service, wiping and polishing, ordering the candlesticks, tending the altars, straightening the kneelers. Prayers softened to their daily tone. Stone kept what stone keeps: the shape of sound, the blur of footsteps, the memory of crossings impressed upon its grain. But stone keeps only the body. Smell and memory follow the living out into the world. They lodge in the folds of garments, in the throats of those who stood too long near the bier, in the phrases that people reach for when they mean to say something fitting, and find instead that the unsayable has already arrived. In galleries and guardrooms, in kitchens and writing closets, the tale adjusted itself to new surroundings, trading incense for ink and ritual for routine. From here, the story began to move from the odour of the sick room to the paper and the power that outlast breath. There were wills to be read and copied, clauses to be weighed, names to be arranged with the care of a mason setting keystones. There were provisions about guardianship, about who should speak in the sovereign's name, and in what order, about how a realm should move when a boy takes the throne. The pen, which had paused while the coffin descended, resumed its course. Wax cooled under seals. Lists thickened under the hands that knew how to make them thick without making them unwieldy. What had been managed with herbs and resins became, in this new phase, a matter for parchment and formula. The court that had practiced the new etiquette of bowing without breathing now practiced another, of speaking in sentences that balanced care with decision, of acknowledging the past days without letting them dictate the next ones, of placing weight where weight would hold. The same caution that had avoided the word omen avoided now any word that might suggest division, yet beneath the careful phrases lay the same pressure that had bent the candle's flames, the knowledge that the air had changed, that something strong had gone out of it, and that replacements must be found in ink. The chapel continued its quiet work of order and prayer, and the city, its loud work of commerce. Between them ran the narrow path of transition, on which officials walked with documents in cases and expressions trained to neutrality. A realm does not stop. It leans. It lists. It writes itself by means that seem unromantic, until one notices that romance is a luxury of calmer days. The residue of sweetness at ankle height, whether true or imagined, yielded to the drier smell of sanded parchment and warm sealing wax. The hands that had held the pall now held quills. The eyes that had watched the pulley's chain now watched lines of text. If anyone paused in the chapel to test the air, that was their private business. The public business lay in assembling the shapes that would hold a government together, while a child learns the weight of a crown. Thus the tale turned. As tullies must, from the senses to the sentences, from the chamber to the council, from breath to clause. And in that turning lay a different kind of containment, not the promise that stone can keep all secrets, but the promise that words, rightly placed, you can keep a country from scattering when a single life has ended. After the funeral, the smell that truly lingered did not lie in the vault, but at the desk in the papers drafted and sealed during those last nights. In signatures that looked like the king's hand, yet might not have been placed by the king himself. Whether historians accept or dismiss the reports of scent at Windsor matters less than the atmosphere that settled over those who served a spreading unease. A recognition that choices had been made within a chamber thick with illness, fatigue, perfumed air, and shuttered windows. The court learned a new habit to keep the machinery of life turning, to pretend not to notice the unpleasant. So the city and palace resumed their motions. Families returned to houses that had been left in haste, brushing ash from hearths before coaxing the fire to life again. Locksmiths went from door to door, turning keys in locks that had stood open through the long passage of the cortege, testing the springs, oiling the wards, restoring the ordinary resistance of wood against hand. Tailors, who had stitched through the solemn nights, looked down at pricked fingers and taped them before taking up the needle again. The chapel continued in its round of prayers and polishing, its clergy setting order to candlesticks and linens, its sextons making quiet notes of wax and wick. Stone kept the body and the symbol. It could not keep the memory of the air. Those who had stepped into the sick room carried the smell outward in a figurative way. They had learned to speak briefly and to breathe shallowly, to economize the use of lungs as well as words. They had learned the anxiety of misstep under a gaze that registered pain as displeasure, even in other rooms, under other ceilings. They kept the cadence of that chamber, sentences trimmed to essentials, pauses measured to the rhythm of breath, movements edited so that nothing jarred. The habit of caution, formed between the bed and the footstool, did not end at the threshold. It walked the corridors with them and sat beside them at the writing table. At that table lay the true residue. Orders drafted in the narrow hours had been pressed with wax, while the king drifted between clarity and fever. The seal had fallen clean. The words were correct. The formulas were unimpeachable. Yet the memory of how those words had been shaped in a room of heavy curtains, in air dense with amber and rosewater, with a physician's basin cooling by the fire, gave them a different weight. People who handled the packets did so as if the parchment itself might exhale the night it had been made. They were careful not to say so. A court that had practiced the art of bowing without breathing now practiced the art of acknowledging without naming. Thus the palace adopted a rule of polite blindness. If a clause seemed hasty, it was called timely. If a signature strayed from its usual vigour, it was called fatigued but valid. If a list included a name that surprised, that surprise was folded away under the phrase, "the king's will." The habit was not mere cowardice. It was a means of continuity, a way to keep the great pendulum of governance from stalling while grief hung in the air and the future hovered just out of reach. Life continued because life must. Discretion provided the bridge over an hour that might otherwise have gaped. Outside the precincts of work, the ordinary acts performed their balm. A mother scolded softly, and a child ran, and a dog barked at a cart whose wheel needed truing. The sky offered a weather that was neither omen nor comfort, only the day doing what days do. Men who had marched in black cloaks unbuckled them and hung them straight. Women who had watched the procession placed their shawls in cedar chests. The city's sound thickened by degrees. Hammer to nail, ladle to pot, bell to hour. In such layering, memory found a way to sit down without vanishing. Yet the desk drew the eye back, as desks always do after a death. Here were the packets bound with tape, the schedules of proclamation, the drafts of commendation and reprieve, the instructions for small ceremonies that would follow large ones. Here were the rolls that summarized what had passed and anticipated what must come. And here, most importantly, lay the testament that would be opened, copied, and read with care. The will as an object of law and as a map of intention. On this wood, the realm's great pivot would be greased by ink. The distinction between what stone can hold and what air remembers mattered now. Stone had done its part. It had received the body and the symbol. It had contained the ritual. Air, by contrast, had touched everyone. It had taught a vocabulary of short answers and small breaths. It had rehearsed the fear of error before those who would soon govern. That vocabulary would shape the first meetings after the morning. The first conferences at which the chairs were set closer or farther from the fire. The first murmurs in which old titles were spoken tentatively beside new ones. Behind the door, the chapel went on with its polishing and prayer. Before the door, a clerk sharpened a quill and sanded a page. The transition from stench and rumour to politics after the king's death did not declare itself with any trumpet. It entered on the smallest of sounds. The soft slip of ribbon back from a wax seal. The crisp crackle of parchment unfolded. The first clear word of the first clause. The room held its breath for that word, not in dread of an odour now, but in respect for the force it would carry. The will would be opened. The clauses would be read. The sentences would say, who should guide a realm while a boy learned to bear a crown? Which names would stand nearest to the throne and which would stand a step behind? How favours and obligations would be distributed among those who had waited in antechambers through the long months and years? The question present in every corridor who truly holds power would begin to receive its answer. Not on a battlefield, and not in a chapel, but at a desk that smelled faintly of sanded paper and warm wax. Thus this section closes the chapter of foul air and rumour, in order to make a clean turn toward the chapter that follows. Politics, after the king is gone. The instruments change. The senses recalibrate. The verbs shift from tending to deciding. Yet the old lesson remains in the grain of the wood and in the breathing of those who lean over it. Stone may keep a body, but air keeps a memory. And memory, once it takes the shape of words, becomes power. The door of St. George's Chapel had closed. But the question of who would wear the crown, and by what means, did not wait for the incense to burn out. By the custom of monarchy, at the very moment the king dies, the lawful heir becomes the new sovereign. The king is dead. Long live the king. In the practical life of the court, however, there is always an interval of quiet. The sad news was kept close for a few days, then announced amid solemn ceremony. By the time the proclamation sounded from the mouths of heralds in the capital, Edward the slight child born to Jane Seymour was already King Edward VI, according to the law of succession. That 9-year-old boy ascended not by an act of choice, but by blood and by will. The throne passed under clauses prepared in those long nights beforehand. By candlelight, beside the Great Seal and the dry stamp used in place of a signature, after the announcement, the classical sequence was set in motion. The retinue received the new king at the Tower of London by ancient custom, and from there began the grand procession to Westminster. Along the route, faces in the crowd looked up at a boy in a heavy robe and a furred cap. his smile touched with bewilderment. In the church, the archbishop anointed with holy oil, set the crown, and administered the oath. The coronation day, around the 20th of February, 1547, completed the form, but all understood that the form was a sturdy mask, laid over a reality in motion. For power lies less upon the crown than upon the desk. Henry's will had named a council to oversee. Its clauses sounded proper, emphasizing experience and consensus. Yet every sentence, as already seen, left a gap for interpretation. In the few days before the announcement and immediately after it, the hands that people had begun to whisper of as the busiest, namely the hand wielding the dry stamp, issued a stream of papers establishing a new order. With that momentum, Edward Seymour, the new king's uncle, stepped into the centre. He appeared in the right place, spoke the right words, produced the right documents. While the sealing wax was still warm, the key offices had already settled to one side: control of access to the boy, command of the guards, coordination of the royal correspondence. From that moment, courtiers understood a new measure of favour. Seymour's friends were admitted more quickly. Those long cautious toward him found doors closing sooner. Meetings were fixed at hours convenient to one faction. Letters bearing red seals from the Tower of London moved with unusual speed. Outwardly, everything remained calm. The young king listened attentively to his tutor. Preachers expounded Providence in Sunday sermons. Masons chalked lines for the memorial to the reign just ended. But in the early hours, search warrants went out. Chests were opened. Seals were broken. Letters were read closely for a line that might condemn. It was the familiar music of an order in transition. Thus the answer to "How soon?" and "Who ascends?" has two parts: in law and ritual. The throne passed at the instant Henry breathed his last, only after a few days. When the first arrangements were set, did the formal proclamation sound, followed by the coronation in February. In the reality of power, a regency council named by the will was created, but it swiftly found a single leading voice imposed upon it: Seymour, with assent recorded in sealed instruments, assumed titles equivalent to protector of the realm and governor of the king's person, phrases that speak softly, yet confer very real control. Each word oversight slid lightly into direction, and direction slid again into command. Not by loud oration, but by repeated paper and seal. The manner of succession was therefore a compound of ceremony and administrative technique. Shouts of acclamation along the procession route, and the rustle of documents in closed rooms. A crown placed on the head of a 9-year-old boy, and a seal pressed into lines of text arranged by adults. Those who had gone in and out of Henry's sick room, breathing the strange air of those final weeks, now carried with them the habit of not inquiring too deeply into the origin of a signature. So long as the document bore enough seals, the wheels would turn. So long as the phrases sounded sufficiently proper, suspicion could be pushed to another day. Of course, not everyone acquiesced easily. In corners of corridors where no clerk took minutes, there were whispers of late alterations, of phrases inserted at just the right moment to turn the power to oversee into the power to command. Yet the machinery moved forward, because the whole court had learned a necessary reflex, to pretend not to notice the unpleasant so that life might continue. And life here meant the life of a kingdom that required continuity. Taxes still collected, victuals still issued to the army, courts still sought, churches still prayed. Not every crown placed on a head makes power flow in by nature. For Edward, the first thing to move after the funeral was not swords and spears in the yard, but the desk in the council chamber. That 9-year-old boy might not yet have had the strength to grasp a sceptre, but he learned very quickly how to grasp the language of power, to read a petition, to ask the right single question, and most importantly to consent on paper. From a schoolboy's chair, The king's voice passed through the conduit of the Regency Council, was filtered by adults into sentences, sealed, and sent throughout the realm. The first to set the tempo was Edward Seymour, the new king's maternal uncle, bearing two titles that sounded gentle yet sharp: Protector of the Realm and Governor of the King's Person. He at once renewed the Northern War to force a marriage between Edward and Mary, Queen of Scots. Success came in arms. The Battle of Pinkie in 1547 gave England a resounding victory. Trouble came in diplomacy. The wedding by the sword only pushed Scotland decisively toward France. The battlefield brought short-term glory. The treasury bent under a long-term burden. At home, Seymour pursued in parallel religious conversion and reform. Orders dissolving chantries and small chapels sent property into the royal coffers and the pockets of intimates. The first English edition of the Book of Common Prayer appeared, gradually replacing Latin with the vernacular. Ritual lost some old mystery and gained the didactic tone reformers desired. But changes in the church arrived alongside changes in the market. The coinage was debased. Prices rose. Enclosures multiplied. Common pasture was lost. In the summer of 1549, England shook. The West rose against the new prayer book. The East against enclosure, prayer, and bread burned at once. Blood was shed to keep the new laws. And Seymour's seat therefore rocked. When the gun smoke cleared, the council looked again at its chief. Seymour was isolated and then arrested. The style of protector fell from his hand. John Dudley, later Duke of Northumberland, stepped into the gap with a style of practical regency. He preferred peace to cheap glory. He returned Boulogne to France in exchange for money and quiet. He halted the slide of debasement and planned to reform the coinage rather than stoke inflation. Dudley did not fuss over fine phrases. He placed men, tidied the books, patched the treasury, and kept the streets from the next shock. Equally important, Edward grew quickly. Unlike his father in those final years, the young king was healthy and keen-minded, his diary dry, brief. Exact reveals a spirit closely bound to the Reformation. Simplified rites, clear sermons. An altar no longer treated as mystery, but as the table of the Word. Under that cast of mind, the second edition of the Book of Common Prayer went further against older practices. The 42 Articles sketched a new theology for the Church of England. Archbishop Cranmer supplied pen and intellect. Dudley supplied the political arm that turned chapters into edicts, sermons into policy. Diplomacy in Dudley's hands became less dreamy and more hard-headed. He abandoned the northern fantasy of binding marriage by the sword, made peace with France to relieve war costs, and reserved strength for domestic stability. Finance threadbare from war, and Henry's extravagance was stitched up by selling crown assets, tightening expenditure, and gradually staunching the loss of value in the coin. There was no miracle. There were only measured decisions, done steadily, and at the right time. Though still a youth, Edward was not merely a smiling seal. He signed in truth, heard petitions in truth, and asked theological questions fit for a boy king that many grown men avoided. Why this practice rather than that? Why prayer should be thus and not otherwise? His mark showed most plainly in the severity toward the old Catholic usages. Images were removed, altars replaced by tables, vestments pared back. The old ecclesiastical courts faded, and blasphemy was redefined by a new key. Granted, everything still passed across Dudley's desk, but the voice of the edicts drew ever closer to the king's belief. As the machine ran more smoothly, the court learned a new habit: to put things plainly on paper that earlier had relied on prestige. Offices were put into proper frames. Procedure was standardized. The habit of doing by name gave way to doing by document. Those who had prospered in the dim corners of Henry's late court found the new world better lit, in a well-lit place. Reason defeat rumour. Even so? Power, in a minority reign, always casts a long shadow named the next succession. Dudley, practical and quick, knew that illness fells not only old men, it can swerve suddenly through a young life. Thus, alongside reform, he quietly planned the succession. If the young king died early, how could the path now opening avoid being wrenched aside? The answer was not yet written, but the preparatory hand was already peeking through. Who was raised up? Who was married? To whom? Who held which shire? All looked like small moves in a larger game of chess, forming behind closed doors.